I worked as a neurologist at Riverbend Regional Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or at least I did until I handed in my resignation last month. For the sake of this account, you can call me Dr. Michael Barrett. Most colleagues over the years just nickname me the brain guy. In my 22 years on staff, I encountered every imaginable neurological crisis: strokes, tumors, seizure conditions, head trauma, and nearly every form of damage the brain can sustain. But one case shattered my understanding of consciousness, and it ultimately pushed me out of the field entirely. Riverbend is a major referral hospital serving southeastern Tennessee and the northern Georgia region. It's a full-scale facility with a dedicated neuro unit that routinely handles the most severe brain injury cases. During my time there, I consulted on countless patients in vegetative states, families desperate for any sign of recovery, and situations where the boundary between life and death was both medical and ethical. The case I'm about to share began long before I personally became involved. The story started on September 17, 1988, in the quiet mountain town of Walden, Tennessee, about 15 miles northeast of Chattanooga. Officer Gary Dockson was 35 years old and had been a police officer for only 3 months. That Saturday evening was uneventful, the kind where the most anyone expected was a fender bender or a noise complaint. At around 9:30 p.m., Gary responded to a 911 call about a domestic dispute. It sounded like routine work, the type of call he had already answered many times. He drove to the address provided, parked his cruiser, and approached the house. What he didn't realize was that he was walking straight into an ambush. The call had been placed by Samuel Donnelly, a 68-year-old man harboring resentment against the police. Frustrated after repeated noise citations from his neighbors and law enforcement, Donnelly decided to set a trap. When Gary identified himself at the front door, Donnelly was waiting, armed with a pistol. Without warning, he fired a single round directly into Gary's forehead at point-blank range. The bullet penetrated just above Gary's left brow and split into 2 pieces as it tore through his brain. One fragment lodged deep in the left frontal lobe, the other pushed toward the back of the skull. The trauma was catastrophic, an injury that should have been instantly fatal. Gary collapsed on the porch, bleeding heavily. Neighbors who heard the gunshot dialed for help, and within minutes, paramedics and additional officers arrived. They found Gary unconscious, his breathing shallow, his pulse barely present but still there. He was rushed to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga, where the trauma team and neurosurgeon on call, Dr. Robert Mendoza, reviewed the CT scan. The damage was staggering. Massive destruction of the left frontal lobe, the region tied to decision-making, language, and motor control. Hemorrhage filled the surrounding tissue. Dr. Mendoza made the decision to operate immediately. The surgery stretched over 8 hours. Bone fragments and clots were removed, and about 20% of Gary's frontal lobe was excised. The bullet pieces were left in place, though attempting to extract them would have caused even greater destruction. Against the odds, Gary survived the procedure, but only barely. For the next 2 weeks, his survival was uncertain. Doctors worked to stabilize intracranial pressure and reduce swelling, hoping he might regain awareness. It never came. After a month in intensive care, Gary was transferred to long-term care with a diagnosis of persistent vegetative state. His body cycled through sleep and wake periods. His eyes sometimes opened, and he occasionally grimaced or made sounds. But there was no evidence of conscious thought. This was where my path crossed with his, though not until years later. In 1992, I accepted a position at Riverbend as Chief of Neurology, overseeing an expanded department and consulting on long-term cases throughout the region. Gary's file was one of dozens I reviewed during my early months. By that point, he had been in a vegetative state for 4 years. I studied his scans, read through stacks of notes, and visited him at the facility on Signal Mountain where he lived. His condition was exactly what I anticipated: a severely brain-damaged patient with occasional, inconsistent reflexes. He could breathe on his own, his eyes sometimes tracked movement, and he would now and then squeeze a hand placed in his palm. But these actions were unreliable, more reflex than deliberate. His family, especially his brother Dennis and his 2 sons, were adamant that he was still in there. They insisted he responded to simple yes or no questions by blinking, and that he seemed more attentive when they spoke about his past. I understood their hope, but I had seen this pattern countless times before. Families interpret reflexes as signs of awareness because they need to believe their loved one is present. It's human, it's compassionate, but clinically, it's almost never true. I examined Gary on several occasions between 1992 and 1995. Each time the results were unchanged. His EEG showed sleep-wake cycling but no higher-level activity to suggest consciousness. His prognosis was bleak yet stable. With attentive care, vegetative patients can live for years, but meaningful recovery after the first year is virtually unheard of. By the 7-year mark, recovery becomes neurologically impossible. By early 1996, Gary's case was routine in my workload, regular reviews, medication adjustments, and counselling the family, but no expectation of change. That was until the weekend of February the 10th, 1996. Gary had developed pneumonia, a dangerous but common complication in patients who are bedridden. His condition rapidly worsened. By Saturday night, he was running a high fever of 104 degrees Celsius and vita, struggling to breathe. The staff called an ambulance and he was transferred to Riverbend, where I was summoned as the neurologist on duty because of my familiarity with his history. Late that night, when I examined him in the emergency ward, I knew he was in critical shape. The pneumonia was aggressive, spreading through both lungs, and the dangerously high fever was putting even greater strain on his already damaged brain. His neurological responses were weaker than ever. Not even his occasional eye tracking or small reflexes were present this time. Dr. James Farley, our pulmonologist, evaluated Gary and concluded that he needed immediate, intensive treatment to drain his lungs and fight the infection. That decision left the family in a terrible position. Either allow nature to take its course and let Gary pass peacefully, or subject him to invasive treatment that might save his life but would not improve his underlying brain condition. I sat with Gary's brother Dennis for a long time that Saturday evening, walking him through the realities. Dennis had carried the burden of medical decisions for nearly 8 years, and the weight of it showed. "Doctor, he's been fighting for so long," Dennis said, voice cracking with grief and exhaustion. "Part of me thinks maybe we should let him rest. But what if he hears us? What if he's been aware all this time and we just give up?" I tried to balance compassion with truth. "Dennis, I know how much you've stood by him. But Gary's injury is severe and permanent. The fragments in his frontal lobe, the years he's remained unresponsive, all of it makes recovery in any real sense impossible. But he blinks when we ask questions. Sometimes he looks like he knows our voices. I understand why it feels that way," I told him gently, "but those are almost certainly reflexes. The brain can produce them even without conscious awareness." After painful discussion, the family chose aggressive care. Gary was admitted to the ICU, placed on IV antibiotics, and supported with medication for fever and breathing. Dr. Farley scheduled surgery for Monday morning to drain his lungs if no improvement came. By Sunday evening, February 11th, I made my usual rounds through the ICU. His fever had dropped from 104 degrees Celsius to 101 degrees Celsius with the antibiotics. His breathing was still strained, but he was somewhat more stable from a pulmonary standpoint. Neurologically, nothing had changed. His chart read the same as always. Minimal responses, eyes mostly closed, no sign of awareness. At around 4 a.m. on Monday, February the 12th, 1996, my phone rang. It was the ICU nurse, and her voice carried a tension I'll never forget. "Dr. Barrett, you need to get here right now. It's Gary. He's awake and talking." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. After 7.5 years in a vegetative state, waking up and speaking was simply not possible. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Gary Barrett is awake and alert. He's been talking with his sister for the past hour. He's asking questions, answering back, like he never left." I drove to the hospital faster than I should have, convinced it had to be some kind of error. Maybe he was making sounds the family mistook for words, or perhaps seizure activity was triggering unusual noises. But when I entered the ICU at 4:45 a.m., I found a sight that overturned everything I had been taught about neurology. Gary was sitting upright in bed, holding a conversation with his sister, Lisa. His eyes were bright, following movement in the room with unmistakable recognition. When I walked closer, he looked directly at me. "Are you Dr. Barrett?" he asked. "Lisa said I've got pneumonia. How bad is it?" For several seconds I couldn't respond. Just hours earlier I had seen him completely unresponsive. Now he was alert, coherent, and fully aware of his surroundings. "Gary," I said, slowly sitting beside him, "do you know where you are?" "I'm in the hospital," he answered without hesitation. "Lisa told me I've got pneumonia, but I feel a lot better than I did yesterday." "Do you remember what brought you here? Do you remember why you've been sick?" his brow furrowed as he searched his memory. "I just remember being really, really sick. Like I've been asleep for a long time, but I don't know exactly what happened. Lisa says it's been a while since I was okay." I glanced at Lisa, who was crying openly. For years she had read to him, told him family stories, begged for a sign. Now, after all that time, he was not only hearing her, he was answering back. "Gary, what's the last thing you remember clearly before all this?" But I asked Dad. He paused, then said, "I remember working security at the university in Chattanooga. Night shifts, it was cold outside. That's what I remember." That memory was years before he had ever joined the police department in Walden. He had no recollection of becoming an officer, no memory of the shooting that put him in this condition, and no awareness that nearly 8 years of his life had passed unresponsive. Over the next several hours, I carried out the most extraordinary neurological examination of my career. Gary's mental abilities seemed shockingly preserved, considering the massive brain trauma he had endured. He could do simple arithmetic without hesitation, recall vivid details from years before his injury, and hold nuanced conversations on a variety of subjects. His speech was fluent and precise. His answers were appropriate, timely, and contextual. His memory of life before 1988 was intact, though he showed no recollection of anything that had happened after that year. What stunned me most was how unchanged his personality appeared. According to his family, he sounded exactly like the man they remembered. He was cracking jokes, asking after his horses by name, and insisting on talking to longtime friends. It was as though his consciousness had been frozen in place for 7.5 years, only to be suddenly unpaused. Of course, his body still bore the burden of his injuries. Gary was paralyzed from the chest down, with no control over his bladder or bowels. His fine motor skills were diminished, though he could still grasp objects and gesture while speaking. These deficits aligned perfectly with the destruction in his frontal lobe and motor cortex. That morning, I contacted every neurological expert I could reach. Throughout the day, Gary was evaluated by neurologists, neurosurgeons, neuropsychologists, and psychiatrists. Every one of them left his bedside baffled. His brain scans, lab work, and clinical exams offered no explanation. We ordered CTs, MRIs, full blood panels, and EEG studies. The images showed exactly what we had always known: extensive destruction of frontal lobe tissue, embedded bullet fragments, scarring, and atrophy. Nothing looked improved. Nothing suggested regeneration. Yet his EEG now displayed clear, normal waking activity, consistent with conscious awareness, a radical shift from the vegetative patterns we had documented for years. Gary spent that Monday in constant conversation. Relatives poured in from out of state, astonished to hear his voice again. Old friends spoke to him, confirming it was unmistakably Gary, personality and humour intact. He asked for updates on his sons, now 12 and 20, though in his memory they were still a 5-year-old and a preteen. The moment that struck me hardest came when he pressed for answers about time. His sister tried to soften it, but Gary turned to his brother directly. "How long have I been sick?" Dennis hesitated, looked at me, then finally said, "Gary, it's been almost 8 years since the shooting." Gary sat with this information silently, then nodded. 7.5 years. That explains why it feels like I've been sleeping forever, and why the boys are grown. He went on to ask practical questions about politics, world events, and how the family had managed. When told that the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had collapsed, he gave a small shake of his head. "Sounds like I missed some important history." But as that remarkable day wore on, I noticed changes. His speech was still clear, but his enthusiasm began to wane. By evening, he answered questions, but initiated fewer conversations. On Tuesday, February the 13th, Gary remained alert, but his speech had slowed. He responded when spoken to, still appropriate and aware, yet the flowing stories and animated dialogue from the day before were gone. By Wednesday, February 14th, most of his answers were yes/no or brief phrases. The long, detailed conversations had disappeared. It felt like he was slipping back toward the unresponsive state that had defined the past 7 years. On Thursday, February the 15th, Gary underwent the lung surgery Dr. Farley had originally scheduled. The procedure succeeded from a pulmonary standpoint, but after anesthesia, his fragile window of consciousness seemed to close. He was awake, but his communication was minimal. When asked what time it was, he said simply, "night," though it was broad daylight. When asked his name, he sometimes replied correctly, and sometimes not at all. Over the following weeks and months, Gary occasionally spoke short words or phrases in response to direct questions. At times he identified family members, occasionally he blinked yes or no. But the vibrant, talkative Gary who had emerged for those brief hours was gone, as if his consciousness had receded again into silence. I spent the next several months consumed with trying to understand what had occurred. I reached out to colleagues nationwide, combed through medical journals on vegetative states and consciousness, and reviewed every shred of data from his case. The most plausible explanation pointed back to his pneumonia and the treatment he had received. The intense fever brought on by his infection, together with the strong antibiotics and additional drugs he received, may have temporarily shifted his brain chemistry, unlocking pathways that had long been dormant or suppressed. Yet when we attempted to repeat the process, using the same medications in the same dosages and sequence, nothing occurred. Gary stayed in his minimally responsive condition, showing no return of the clarity he displayed that February. Some of the neurological colleagues I consulted suggested his sudden recovery might have been sparked by the physiological stress of the illness itself, or even by an unconscious awareness of the family's conversations about his treatment, where the threat of death might have triggered a latent neurological reaction. But none of these explanations accounted for the precision of his memory, the intactness of his personality, the nearly 18-hour duration of his awakening, or the gradual decline that followed despite all our efforts to sustain it. The story quickly drew widespread attention, both nationally and internationally, from doctors and the press alike. Headlines referred to Gary as the miracle patient and the coma cop. Academic journals published case reports and analyses of his temporary recovery. Specialists in neurology, neurosurgery, and consciousness research from across the globe contacted me to debate the meaning of his brief return to awareness. Yet despite the coverage, scrutiny, and speculation, those 18 hours of Gary's consciousness remained without a definitive medical or scientific explanation. What unsettled me most as his treating neurologist was what the episode implied about his possible awareness during the 7.5 years that seemed to precede it in silence. If Gary could awaken and instantly converse in complex, coherent dialogue, if he could recognize family members unseen for nearly 8 years, if he could recall past details and display his full personality and intellect, then how much of that time had he actually been aware of? I began replaying every family interaction I had witnessed over the years. When they insisted, he answered questions through deliberate blinking patterns. When they swore, he seemed more attentive during certain talks. When they reported that he reacted to familiar voices or followed movement with his eyes, perhaps they had been right all along. The idea that Gary might have remained conscious, or at least partly aware, throughout those 7.5 years, trapped inside a body unable to respond, was deeply troubling, both in my role as a physician and as a human being. It forced me to wonder how many other patients could be similarly imprisoned, listening, thinking, and feeling, but unable to signal their awareness to the outside world. Gary's family became convinced he had absorbed every word spoken at his bedside, every update, every prayer, every expression of love. They believed his awakening was proof that he had been present with them all along, silently enduring. I wanted to dismiss that as desperate hope, a natural human impulse to assign meaning. Yet Gary's vivid memories, preserved personality, genuine emotions, and instant recognition of long-lost faces made it difficult to argue he had simply switched on after years of nothingness. Gary Dockson passed away on April 15, 1997, 13 months after his extraordinary 18-hour awakening. The cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs, a frequent and often deadly complication among patients with such severe immobility. His death was not unexpected, given his medical condition and the inherent dangers of long-term paralysis. But it marked the close of one of the most perplexing and significant cases ever documented in the medical study of consciousness and persistent vegetative states. In the months between his fleeting return to awareness and his passing, Gary sometimes uttered single words or brief phrases when directly prompted. But he never again displayed the kind of steady, conscious interaction he had shown during those remarkable 18 hours in February of 1996. It felt as if he had been granted a temporary release from his neurological confinement, just long enough to reconnect with those he loved and affirm his presence, before slipping back into the unresponsive state that had defined most of his final years. His case permanently reshaped how I approached neurology and the care of patients. I grew far more careful about declaring anyone to be permanently unconscious or beyond the possibility of meaningful recovery. I began listening more closely to families who insisted their loved ones were showing subtle hints of awareness that routine examinations failed to detect. I also immersed myself in research surrounding consciousness, prolonged vegetative states, and the creation of better diagnostic methods for identifying minimal signs of awareness in patients with severe brain injuries. Gary's story revealed how limited our grasp of consciousness truly was and suggested that people who appeared entirely unresponsive might still possess more inner awareness than medicine could measure. But the impact extended beyond my clinical decisions. It shook me personally and philosophically in ways I struggled to resolve. For months after his death, I would lie awake at night replaying what I had witnessed. If Gary had been aware throughout those 7 silent years, what must that existence have been like for him? Did he feel the despair of being unable to respond? Did he hear every word spoken, every decision made, every touch given? The possibility that someone might endure conscious life locked inside an unmoving body was almost unbearable to imagine. From that point on, I questioned my approach with every vegetative patient I evaluated. During examinations, I often found myself silently wondering, are they hearing me? Do they grasp the weight of what I am saying about their future? Do they know their families are considering life-altering choices based on my judgment that they are unaware? These thoughts began to erode my confidence as a physician. I started doubting my own conclusions, lingering far longer with patients than necessary in search of elusive signs of awareness, and finding it harder to give families the firm answers they needed. 6 months after Gary's passing, I was called to consult on the case of a young woman who had remained in a vegetative state for 3 years after a car accident. While explaining to her family that her condition was irreversible and that she exhibited no meaningful signs of awareness, I saw what looked like a tear sliding down her cheek. Her relatives insisted she often cried when sorrowful topics were raised, and that her expressions shifted depending on what they said to her. I had always dismissed such reactions as reflexes and coincidence, but after Gary, I could not help but wonder if I was wrong. Was she hearing everything I was saying about her hopeless outlook? I completed the consultation, but deep down I knew I could not continue practicing neurology under the shadow of such uncertainty. How could I assure families their loved ones were unconscious when I had already witnessed the impossible once before? 3 weeks later, I resigned from Columbia Park Ridge Medical Center. In my official letter, I wrote that I was leaving for other opportunities, but the truth was that Gary's case had deeply unsettled everything I believed about the brain, awareness, and human consciousness. I moved to a smaller community and began a general practice centered on routine care, diabetes, blood pressure, preventive medicine, areas with clearer diagnoses and established treatments. I carefully avoided neurological cases, head injuries, or anything involving questions of awareness, yet never stopped thinking of Gary. I followed new studies on consciousness, vegetative states, and the emerging technologies like functional MRI that showed promise for detecting hidden signs of thought in patients long considered unreachable. Gary Dockery's story remains one of the best documented and most widely studied examples of unexpected recovery from a prolonged vegetative state. It continues to appear in medical papers, to be debated at conferences, and to serve as a point of reference in discussions on consciousness, end-of-life care, and the ethics of treating brain-injured patients. But to me, Gary's case is not just an academic phenomenon. It is a reminder of the profound mysteries still surrounding the human mind. For any physician, there are few experiences more humbling than encountering a case that shatters their assumptions and reveals how incomplete their expertise truly is. By all logic, Gary Dockery should never have awakened. His brain damage was too severe, the years of unresponsiveness too long, the imaging studies too unchanged. His return to full awareness, even for 18 hours, should have been medically impossible. Yet it happened. For those brief hours, he was lucid, intact, and able to speak with his family in ways that confirmed his memory, personality, and presence were still there. It was an event science still cannot fully explain. But the real lesson is not simply medical or scientific, it is deeply human. Gary's awakening suggests that those we label as vegetative or unconscious may still be far more present than we realize. His 18 hours of clarity gave his family the priceless gift of knowing he had been there all along, listening, feeling, aware. They were able to share their love and hear his in return, proving their devotion had never been in vain. For medicine, his story stands as a call to treat all brain-injured patients with the possibility of hidden awareness in mind. It reminds us that the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness is more complex than our tests can currently reveal. For me, Gary's case will forever remain the most unsettling and humbling moment of my career. It showed me that, despite all our scientific progress, there are still truths about life, the mind, and the nature of being awake that lie far beyond our understanding.